share my screen. For those who don't know, I talked before last time about bosoning for the rest of the milestone, and then writing up a boson doc and handing it off. My objective was to kind of be a little bit more execution oriented, start to triage a milestone and just kind of try to get us rolling with a cadence. We're kind of trying to consistently burn things down. For folks who saw, I sent an email yesterday to try to follow up if you have issues that are currently assigned. So I started curating some of the agenda items. What I typically do in some of the other meetings too is I have a follow up on action items. It's to make sure that we kind of are doing what we're saying we're doing. Paris and Brandon and Michelle, did you have a chance to discuss the CNCF G Suite issue that we talked about last time? I know there was a ticket that was supposed to be filed, but I don't know if Brandon and Michelle didn't say that they had any visibility on it.
So we got visibility in some of the tickets, but I haven't had a chance to do anything more.
Okay. So there's currently an issue here. Is it okay if we assign that issue to you, Brandon, and follow up next time again?
Sure. I thought it was already assigned. That's fine.
It's hard for me to see with these sunglasses on. You might be winning just by ability to see.
We should just have like the first 5 minutes of the meeting only, and then it's sunglasses off.
The next one was a follow-up on the user group formation. You sent an email out to the mailing list soliciting for other people to help you with that. Has anyone volunteered?
Yeah, the response has been fantastic. We have Dominique is working. Is she on the call by any chance? No. She's working on this. She has a draft out. And there's a few other folks who volunteered to review. We put together a Google group for the folks who expressed interest. We also had, I think, about a half dozen people expressed interest in working on this sort of task in the future. So I think for other areas where we need to flesh out governance, I think we have a stack of volunteers available. I think looking at the contribute ladder might be a good next task for us to consider.
Okay.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised, pleasantly at the number of people who were interested in this topic.
It looks like Paris had her hand up.
We actually had a conversation today, contributor experience. I know Nikita and Bob are both on the phone about doing a PR into the community membership doc anyway, so maybe we can all work together on that.
I think that'd be great. I don't know if we need to, do we want to write up any details in the current issue that was assigned to you, Phil, which I think is this one?
About this item or about the more generally governance?
About this particular item, I think, or if we want to open up a new issue to track or follow with regards to trying to help solicit the broader audience for efforts like this, try to coordinate it, orchestrate it a little bit cleaner.
Yeah, I'll create a new issue for maybe a meta issue for instead of governance issues we can start working on. And just keep this one about the user group stuff specifically. I just updated it saying that there should be a draft available in the next day or two that we'll publish.
Okay, sounds great. There was one mail that came in from the mailing list. I think Nikita added this to the agenda too as well, with regards to can working groups have other working groups as stakeholders? And I think we have enough quorum here to vote yes or no on this.
Right. So fun fact, A, I added it. B, we don't actually have a document that says what quorum's supposed to be anymore.
Yeah, we did.
We used to. I don't know if the word quorum doesn't show up. We don't have a supermajority here. We have a majority, but not a supermajority. Oh, wait, maybe now we do that now that Michelle is here. Supermajority is supposed to be 2/3, right? Anyway, I don't think anybody is disagreeing with the consensus there. I kind of want to just start the thread off, and if we have no verbal objections here, I think we can proceed.
Okay. Does anyone disagree?
No, we should go ahead with whatever is the consensus on the thread.
Okay. All right, that was easy. Next up, I mentioned last time that Nishi and Andrew Sai-Kim had been working a proposal to collapse cloud provider. This has been a long-standing issue, and I wanted to give them a chance to discuss it with the steering committee. Andrew and Nishi, are you on?
Yep. If you want to open the proposal, I can walk through it. Awesome, thank you. So yeah, we started this effort in January this year, and we wrote down the proposal in terms of why we think consolidating the cloud providers would make sense. Basically, what we are proposing is all the cloud provider SIGs will become sub-projects under SIG Cloud Provider. And currently the sub-projects that, for example, SIG AWS has 7 sub-projects, they would all move under SIG Cloud Provider, and they would be tagged with a provider tagging, which sort of reflects which cloud provider the sub-project belongs to. But this would also give us an opportunity to streamline and standardize the processes with respect to documentation, release cadence for all the out-of-tree features. And also, as we started building a lot of cloud controllers, we realized that this might be a better approach to host all the controllers under one project. So the reasons for doing this would also lend itself well to the stability of the core code base. And we wanted to make sure that the test grid efforts that we did in SIG AWS also moves across each of the SIG, and we can, again, host them under SIG Cloud Provider. So that's all the reasoning that we've written out there. There are some structural decisions we made and kind of proposals that we talked through. So if you go down a little bit, I can explain those in more detail.
Nishi, can I ask a question here?
Sure, then.
Do all the SIGs have code currently? Do they have repositories?
Not all of them.
So if they don't have a repository, then what does it mean to have a sub-project with no repositories?
So most of the SIGs actually, when we started this effort, had at least the cluster API project. I'm not sure, and Andrew, you can correct me on this. The reason I said that one of the SIGs, which is SIG VMware, may not have a project is because I believe the cluster API project was going to be moved under SIG cluster lifecycle. But the rest of the projects rest of the SIGs have 1 or 2 sub-projects underneath them.
Yeah, so the only SIG that may not have any code right now is SIG IBM. But we're transitioning them into sub-projects historically because the SIG was already formed, even if there's no code under the SIG. And so we're just kind of for compatibility reasons and for the users already in the SIG, we're just kind of put them under as sub-projects.
Yeah, I think OpenStack has a bunch, GCP has 2, Azure has 3 or 4, and VMware has cluster API. And AWS has 7 sub-projects, yeah.
And this is Derek. Maybe just to clarify, so I think an earlier comment you said I guess the transition from the existing in-tree cloud providers to out-of-tree cloud providers, were you saying that they would consolidate under one repo or many repos?
Under many repos. So there are 2 things. One is the in-tree cloud provider to out-of-tree cloud provider, that is a separate effort altogether, because there are some interfaces that need to be re-engineered, and that effort is happening in SIG Cloud Provider right now with all the providers working together, AWS and Google primarily. But there are some smaller sub-projects that can end up as controllers. For example, the ALB ingress controller for SIG AWS is a sub-project, but it can end up as a controller. We don't know yet. So we're just talking about these sub-projects that are out-of-tree features. We will just make them repositories under SIG Cloud Provider, and we will tag them as AWS-sub-project name. Does that make sense?
And CSI is a good example of this as well, because SIG Storage has vocalized that they do not want to own any code that is vendor specific. And so having this structure kind of allows SIG Cloud Provider to take ownership of some of those repos if needed.
So if you go down, I can walk through the steps of what we are proposing.
Is this good, or are you looking further down?
Yeah, this table basically shows that we discussed this proposal with each of the SIG leads, and each one of them agreed. I think Andrew removed he accepted the entries, but essentially each one of them entered that they agree after reading through the proposal, which I wanted to drive and make sure everyone is on the same page. If you go further down, then there are some things that we would need in order to make this happen. And this is where we need thinking, and maybe we're missing something. But essentially what we're saying is there are dedicated sessions in KubeCon that are provided to each SIG. What the SIGs would like to do is have an informal user group sort of discussion. But then there's also this idea that maybe SIG Cloud Provider can have a longer session where they can get all the other SIGs to come in and talk about their sub-projects and do demos. So that's a proposal we are suggesting. Again, this is something that we have to discuss with you all and also get agreement on, but this might help because we still want to keep our user group feel supported, but we don't want to really wait for the user group governance to happen before collapsing the sub-projects. The second aspect was the meeting cadence and the Zoom links and the Slack channels that we have. Just to make some progress, because it's already been 3 months of excessive effort, we wanted to rename everything with the format of provider dash provider. So essentially we just say provider dash AWS, all the Slacks and bi-weekly meetings. And then in the SIG Cloud Provider README, we can list everything that belongs to SIG AWS or SIG Azure or everything, collapse that into one page and not have separate SIG README pages. The third aspect was the quarterly community updates. Instead of having each SIG come and give quarterly community updates, maybe we have an umbrella SIG Cloud Provider update. And that usually I remember that you give 3 SIGs a slot to speak. In this particular format, we're suggesting that maybe SIG Cloud Provider can provide an umbrella update in one community meeting. And that frees up some slots for other SIGs or other discussions as well. The other item is GitHub labels and notifications. What do we do about that? So our suggestion was, again, leave it as provider slash AWS or provider slash Azure, which again, we want ideas and thoughts around. Provider sub-project discoverability. This again, we would have the sigs.yaml list all the sub-projects as belonging to whatever specific provider and list all of them under SIG Cloud Provider. That way we don't have separate entries for SIG AWS or SIG Azure or any other SIG. In terms of sub-project hierarchy, we're talking about Current subprojects will not be renamed because we don't know the impact of what might go wrong if we try to rename all the subprojects in a particular format. So we're suggesting that all new subprojects will have the format subproject name followed by the provider name, which is AWS or Azure or GCP, but we leave the existing ones as they are, and we don't change anything. There's also a discussion on the release cadence. So at least in Amazon, what I did was we tried to follow the in-tree release cadence, and Aaron knows about this, Dennis and Steven know about this. We were told that it doesn't make sense to have out-of-tree features being listed in the in-tree feature list, which kind of makes sense, but then we also want to try and have some process around release of these out-of-tree features because otherwise it impacts quality. So we have an open issue and that is being tracked by SIG release. I think Aaron told me that 1.15 we should make a decision, but I'm not sure when that decision would be made. But the idea is we try to come to a consensus and use SIG Cloud Provider to drive that consensus into each of the provider subprojects. And I already talked about test grid hierarchy. The idea would be to take SIG AWS, SIG Azure, all the linting, all the integration tests and put it under SIG Cloud Provider. And all the sub-projects would reflect right underneath that. For AWS, it should be simple, but this is the structure we're sort of at a high level proposing, and I think everyone is okay with it.
I would probably, as guidance, I would probably move to have some of this documented inside of the community repo. I don't know whether some of this falls into multiple categories. Some of it might be in the charter. Some of it might just be, I don't know, process policies and procedures or something like that. We don't actually have formalization around some of this. But I think documenting it so it's in the community repo, I think would be a good choice.
Okay.
Right. The other thing I wanted to poke at a little bit was, in terms of governance, how do you make sure that all the subprojects have a say in what's happening in the overall SIG?
Yeah. So
like how many team leads, that kind of stuff. How are you selecting people to lead?
yeah. So the idea was to make sure that nothing changes, which means the current co-chairs of, I'll just take SIG AWS as an example. The current co-chairs will remain as the current co-chairs, and the maintainers and the reviewers, which is me, Justin, and a couple of other people who are writing the code, are defined in the owner's file. We meet bi-weekly as usual, nothing changes. It's just that the README doc for SIG AWS would not exist as a separate standalone. What would happen is it would go under the meeting cadence of SIG Cloud Provider, and anybody who wants to join the bi-weekly meeting just goes and clicks on that Zoom meeting. Slack continues as usual. Nothing changes. It's just that we move the sub-projects under SIG Cloud Provider. It's step. Does that make sense, Tim?
So I think,
yeah. Let's see how it morphs. Sorry, Derek, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess the way I was thinking about this, Tim, was that if I'm not mistaken, the existing SIG Cloud Provider charter identifies chairs, but not like tech leads. And you're basically saying what used to be the individuals, what are now the sub-project associated folks, like who would be affiliated with AWS or IBM or GCP or any of the other individual clouds, like their leadership responsibilities and their individual sub-project does not change, but there's no like tech lead over the whole SIG. It's just the set of chairs that are there now. Is that a fair summary? Like I guess the charter today for SIG Cloud Provider lists 3 folks as chairs.
Yeah, and so we're following the steering committee template for that kind of falls under all this, but falls over all the SIGs, right? And that has specifically calls out tech leads, sub-project owners, and members. And so we would be following that for each cloud provider. And so naturally we would assign all the, as Nishi mentioned, we would assign all the existing chairs for each provider as tech leads under each sub-project representing a cloud provider.
I think you just answered my question. I'll ask it again just because I'm being slow today. So to use AWS as an example, currently there are a number of sub-projects associated with AWS, such as the IAM Authenticator, the ALB Ingress Controller, the Encryption Provider, the EBS CSI Driver, the EFS CSI Driver, and the FSX CSI Driver. Are we suggesting that the same set of people are in charge of all of those code bases? Or are we suggesting that, and there's thus one sub-project called AWS that encompasses all of those repos? Or are we suggesting that they continue to each be separate sub-projects that could potentially be owned by different individuals?
My proposal was the former because the latter would be too much change.
Okay.
To start with, and then we can always go down the next route. I just want to make progress without too much friction, which means keeping the same model, but starting with collapsing the sub-projects and making sure all the naming, tagging, everything flows through. And then if we believe that all the sub-projects need to have their individual tech leads, I mean, today we get a lot of benefit by jointly discussing it in the bi-weekly meetings and thinking through the implementation, but that might change and we can make that change in the future.
The other one I wanted to ask was, does the charter need an update? Do you feel that your charter reflects the, covers everything with the new proposal?
So we did just do a charter update with this proposal in mind. And we put a 2-week time box and we had all the existing tech leads, SIG leads take a look at it. And so I don't think it needs to be updated, but more than happy to revisit it once we kind of formalize this process a bit more.
Okay, so I feel like as written, the proposal does not make it clear to me that you are planning to collapse all of the repos into a single sub-project. So I'm trying to be careful with my language here. The provider sub-project hierarchy bullet, number 6, says that the current sub-projects will be transferred over. And it sounds like what you're suggesting is the current repos will be transferred to new sub-projects that collapse everything to a single cloud provider for each cloud provider. And then new repos will follow a format, but they'll all fall under an existing cloud provider's sub-project.
Okay, so to clarify, SIG AWS has the sub-projects that you just listed, right, Aaron? We're going to move those sub-projects directly under SIG Cloud Provider and tag it as -AWS. That's it. And going forward, that is a new repository under SIG Cloud Provider now. It would not be SIG Cloud Provider has a sub-project called SIG AWS with multiple repos. No.
So this is all the formatting of how things are in the sigs.yaml at this point you're talking about, right?
Yes. Okay. So instead of having separate SIG AWS subprojects, we will have SIG Cloud Provider subprojects, and they will either belong to AWS or Azure by the provider tag at the end of the name of the repository.
And the tech leads for those sub-projects are the names enumerated in the stock.
Okay, so I feel like that's describing a world where each individual repo is its own sub-project, and there isn't actually a consistent set of people who has oversight over all of the AWS sub-projects, for example, unless those people happen to live in all of the owner's files in each of those repos.
Correct.
AWS, we do have Justin and I are pretty much in every sub-project because we created this after the sub-projects were only created in the last 2 quarters. But there are also subject matter experts from different areas like storage or ingress or DNS. So there is an overlap in terms of the tech leads, but there's also individual sub-project leads that maintain the code.
Okay, and the tech leads are going to be listed in the 6.yaml.
Yes.
Okay.
They continue to remain in the owner's file.
Okay. I don't know. I feel like that's more confusing to me than just moving all the repos under a single subproject called AWS and Azure and whatever. I'm curious how that limits or complicates things for folks.
Under a single repo? That would
no, single subproject. So that we have, I don't have it in front of me. We have multiple subprojects, like the CSI subproject, for example, spans what, like 30 repos, 40 repos, but it's one single subproject.
That's what she was saying. There's one subproject and it has multiple repos. It might not.
I feel that's what I thought I heard the first time, but as I'm asking clarifying questions, I feel like I'm hearing the other version where we're going to take each individual subproject and just move them over. So right now, AWS has single repo subprojects. And what I'm hoping we live in is a world where there's a single subproject called AWS, but it has multiple repos underneath of it.
That's not the proposal. Yeah, that is not this proposal.
So this is something that we floated before. And one of the reasons why we didn't follow through with it was because the current 6.yaml structure and the tooling we use in the community repo didn't support doing this without having to collapse all the owners files. And so we wanted to respect all the individual owners files that we have today, which is why we kind of went with this model. But if we can change the way we generate 6.yaml and we can have it like an umbrella subproject that can have multiple other subprojects, then I think that'd be fine. But today we don't have that tooling.
I was going to mention earlier on, we kind of lack a better formalization for this type of hierarchy inside of our charters. And I think it's probably on us to follow up. I don't think that should stop this effort so long as it's clear to the parties involved. But I do think we should clean it up from a governance model perspective so that it's clear what we try to accomplish. And it's upon steering to make sure that we do this.
I think also, sorry, go ahead.
Tim and Aaron, is just show you a view of how the README will look like in this new model for, say, cloud provider. And then it becomes visual and easy to comment on.
I think the one thing I do want to say is that, like, you know, we purposefully didn't want to be too prescriptive about the charter for SIGs to leave room for stuff like this. And I think there are going to be SIGs that don't fit the pattern where, you know, there are special considerations. So I think this is totally in line with, you know, the way that we've talked about SIGs, and it just means that it's going to be a little bit more work to suss out the charter, but I think it's totally reasonable.
Yeah, I think I'm okay. I'm okay with that. Like moving, I guess it seems like we could maybe move in 2 steps. We move everything over as is, and then as a follow-up, we could talk about how to effectively collapse things that still gives you sort of the governance structure that you need, where you have some overarching individuals who have insight or oversight of a particular cloud provider's interests, but you have sort of tech leads for each individual repo.
Makes sense.
I don't know. Infinitely nesting hierarchies of things seems a little wonky. An extra layer of hierarchy, maybe. But I think your compromise is good.
We should just use labels. Sorry.
Yeah. So, well, hey, bro, do you actually want to like help us consistently use topics. And then
No,
we
no,
could
no.
use
I'm making the
topics to
comparison
tag
between
everything.
like replica set and pod. We should just use labels.
I mean, if you think about it, we do use labels and control loops to manage most of the PRs in this project. There's nothing saying we couldn't do something similar for our repos. We just don't right now.
Aaron, could I, do you want to take an action item to follow up with a potential best practices update to subprojects in the format of the charter? Or do you want to log an issue perhaps so we can follow up on it again?
You can log an issue. I'm not sure this is going to get done in the May timeframe, though.
That's fine. I'm just saying, like, you're the one who's talking the most about it. So usually,
Sure, I hear you. I hear you. Go ahead and make it. Or I'll make it. I'm just not going to put it in this milestone. Fair.
That's fair. Yeah.
So, Andrew, Nishi, what do you need from us?
Well, I think we needed all these questions to come through, and I probably need a read through of this document one time with comments. We did suggest adding labels and some changes in terms of what would happen to the Slack channel. So I would need help from the contributor X team to actually execute on this. So if you do agree, then I will open an issue and then follow up with Paris and Nikita. And we would like to start executing on this. And I want to know how I can get there.
And some guidance on.
I think I maybe have one other question that's not
Sorry, go ahead.
answered here. And maybe you said it earlier and I wasn't paying attention. What's sort of being done to address the user group aspect of this? Given that we do have user groups as formal entities within the project now,
So
what is your proposal there?
So we explicitly didn't include user groups yet because we had the impression that the definition of user groups is still being formulated. And so many of the members in SIG Cloud Provider are in the user group governance mailing list, and we are going to follow up and make sure we're involved in a lot of the early discussions around what user groups is going to look like. And we do intend on being one of the earlier adopters of user groups. And so the intention would be a user group per cloud provider.
Yeah, that makes sense, because then what you're doing is you're tying in like the cluster API, for example, in OpenStack, the cluster API, the CSI, the cloud provider, the internal, external. So you get a forum to talk about all those things because all of them are running on OpenStack, right? So we definitely need that there. We just don't know who will show up to help form the user groups and lead the user groups, whether it's the same set of people currently, but this is on the development side, right? So we need actual operators and people like that to help seed that, I think.
Couldn't discuss be like the forum by which we use to determine whether or not user groups need a meeting or not? Because you can set up a user group hierarchy and discuss for some of this, and then use that as the forum by which folks can determine whether or not they need a meeting or not.
Right. So currently, most of the people, they end up coming to the SIG OpenStack, for example, right? And then we point them to either the SIG storage folks or the cluster API folks, depending on what they are trying to do. So yeah, discuss seems to be a good way to redirect. But then we still need to seed the user group itself also.
Yeah, I'm not. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the thinking was that the same co-chairs for the SIG provider would work in seeding the user groups, because we're aware of how each of the subprojects are being used by our audience. And by being part of the governance structure, which Phil is driving with Domini, we were hoping to simulate that structure into the user group, but as a second phase of this effort.
More power to you.
No, that sounds good. Thanks. And I apologize if you answered that earlier. That clarified things for me.
Do we need any formal vote on this? Because it would fall underneath this issue, which is issue number 65. I'll paste it inside the chat. I don't know if it does. I think it.
I would rather not vote on it. I'd love to live in the world where the SIGs were empowered to make this decision by themselves. It looks like they have built consensus to do it. We appreciate them running it by us to make sure that everything looks good. But I don't think there's anything we need to do to get in your way.
That's a fair.
Yeah, +1, go for it, right?
Yep.
So we do need some guidance on next steps. I see two paths forward for this. One is we just create a big PR in Kubernetes/community to kind of fold everything under as subprojects, or we kind of time box it and let providers opt into the new structure. Anyone here have opinions on that?
I would say opt in, make them do the work, right?
Okay, any ideas on what a reasonable deadline for this would be? Like 2 months from now? Okay, we can talk offline on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just err on the side of bias for action. I'll start doing it for AWS and then just push it through on cloud provider. Everyone else will follow.
Go forth and merge. I love it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. Any other last questions, comments, complaints, concerns there?
Dims, I think I had one follow on maybe while we're talking about this. So I think in a SIG architecture call, we had talked about trying to have some measure of API consistency or
For the configuration files.
yes. And so what I'm wondering is like, does the governance structure proposed here reinforce that goal?
I would say yes, because they should be talking about the configuration or the API at the SIG cloud provider level. And they should have a consensus amongst all the providers who are their sub-projects.
And
Yeah, I mean,
of the sub-projects that were listed, how many of them are under the Kubernetes org versus like a kubesig org?
They're all under the Kubernetes org right now. For the cloud provider subprojects, not the admin.
Are the CSI ones under the Kubernetes 6 too?
The CSI ones, yes, those are under Kubernetes 6.
Okay.
So I think this is a weird distinction that we should probably lean on architecture to help formalize and not necessarily steering, is that things that the core needs should have some guarantees and consistency. Things that fall outside the core, it's up to the provider or the SIG to determine their life, right?
yeah. I mean, I just want to reiterate, I think, following best practices is great, but I don't think we want to set up gatekeeping across all configuration files across all sub projects everywhere. I think SIGs move forward.
And Joe, for that balance, like I had mostly come at this from a consumer.
It says Derek, but it's a Clayton.
Yeah, we're in the same room together. Sorry.
And it was mostly just a consistency. Like, what's the expectation for someone consuming Kubernetes? Are we kind of letting the dandelion seeds fly and saying, well, yeah, this stuff may be all inconsistent and change, and we trust people, but if it is, like, talk to that project area, like talk to the SIG about that. Like, that was, I think, the heart of it. And it's not that I expect the SIGs to be not responsible. Are we saying explicitly things like SIG release's job is not to ensure that all of these other things can be installed with Kubernetes and don't break people when they regress, et cetera. So that was what triggered that line of thought.
Right.
Yeah, I think this comes down to sort of, I'm sorry, Dims, go ahead, man.
I think the SIG cloud provider should see the value of this suggestion, right, Clayton and Derek? And they should say, yes, we should do that. Sort of us saying it.
This
Yeah,
seems like a great discussion for architecture.
Yeah.
But I think some of this is like, you know, like,
from a project level perspective, as a steering committee, we are explicitly embracing the idea that there will be SIGs in different areas that do different things, that work on different life cycles and make different choices, and that they won't always agree, and that when they don't agree, that's okay, because that is the choice we are deliberately making to be a diverse and heterogeneous culture rather than a monoculture.
yeah.
Yes.
I think there's examples where folks have come to architecture saying, hey, we want to move XYZ into core. And we said, well, does it really need to be in core? Can't you use the extension mechanisms? You'll be able to move faster and you won't have to go through this gatekeeping exercise of presenting things to architecture because it's within the SIG. So we really want to be able to, you know, empower the SIGs to be able to do the thing. Now, that's not saying that we shouldn't encourage them to follow best practices and stuff, but I think that's different from setting up sort of the explicit sort of approval process through something like architecture. It's my thought.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I just want to make sure that if we're changing the governance structure, that the governance structure was aligning to the way of improving what I think in architecture we had raised as a concern.
Right.
And I agree with Dims that this does improve it. I just want to make sure that we all felt that way.
Yeah, I think it does more now than before, because earlier we had separate SIGs, and you know they would have to come to architecture for a consensus. Right now it's the same SIG, same set of people, so hopefully it should work better.
Okay, I want to time box the conversation. I think we have broad consensus on the original proposal, and we did a little bit of bike shedding, which was good, to talk about the implications of what broader level API constraints could occur. But is there any other last things we want to address here, or should we move on? I just want to make sure that we keep to a time box so we can get to the other things. And if we need to, we can follow up with action items.
Right. So I just wanted to get a sense of from Andrew and Nishi on when we can expect things to get out from KK into external repositories, and how documentation can get better, because we've always struggled with documentation with both the internal cloud providers as well as the external ones.
Yeah, so both of those topics are P0 for 115. I can give you a whole spiel on what we're doing there, but it seems like a better discussion for as a cloud provider.
Right. So all of you are working towards it, right? Like all the SIGs, not just Andrew and Nishi, right?
So are we talking like, go ahead.
So the effort to move the interfaces out for the out-of-tree cloud provider work, that is ongoing, and that's primarily being led by AWS GCP, but all the SIGs know about it and they know the effort that's happening there. Documentation has been pending for a very long time because we were confused what to prioritize. Should we document and improve the in-tree cloud provider, or wait for the out-of-tree cloud provider to finish and then update everything? I think, like Andrew said, it's P0 for us this quarter, or this 1.15 cycle. And yes, we all are aligned to making that happen. But just to also clarify, most of the sub-projects right now are pretty much out of tree. They're not KK at all. And for anything that is linked to KK, a specific example would be NLP support, which is in-tree. We work with the in-tree release process. I tried to answer all the questions that was being discussed.
Thank you. That's good to hear that it's P0.
Okay.
It's about time.
I'd like to move on, just because I want to be mindful of some of the other things that are on the agenda, and there's some other things that have come up. If folks want to follow up, I think perhaps we should have an action item to follow up on the update to the charter for next week, as well as the action item for Aaron to log the potential issue, and then we can triage that in the next meeting too as well. For other things related to the state of ongoing efforts, I'd probably recommend going to the SIG cloud provider to discuss there. Does that seem fair? Going once, twice, 3 times. All right, I will move on. There was a newly added issue to our repository, which was regarding Slack moderation. George, are you on?
Yeah, I apologize for bringing this up again, Slack, but we would like to ask steering for help as far as helping find a home for Slack user moderation, as like we're having a hard time doing SIG contributor experience things and also managing the moderation of Slack. We've kind of basically put a finger in the dike. We've expanded the policies and got a bunch of new moderators and all that stuff. And clearly we think that this should be a new SIG. And unfortunately, a lot of us are too oversubscribed to like launch a new SIG. Noah has been trying, but unfortunately he's like an unpaid volunteer part-time. And we feel that this is such an important topic that we would like to ask steering to maybe work with the CNCF, similar to how it was done with SIG docs, where there was a need and CNCF went to the member companies and asked, hey, do you want to staff this? And if not, consider finding like a part-time position or some kind of funding for a community manager to help drive this and other user-facing tasks, which are very important, but just kind of not really contributor experience. It's somewhere in the Venn diagram there, but we think it's something that's important and needs to have staffing. So,
given that it overlaps with the CNCF engagements, does it make sense to have, I'm asking Michelle and Brandon to be engaged on this one?
Yeah, feel free to assign me to it. We're working through like, well, one of our action items is to figure out how to propose things to the CNCF. So this might be a great test case for figuring out what a proposal template looks like. And we can talk more about it on that one as well.
And just to be clear, George, I think, we talked about this a little bit. The idea is that ContribX would help set the tone and the policy for sort of what makes the Kubernetes community the Kubernetes community, but just some of the sort of implementation of that policy, sort of making it effective. That's where we're looking, and organizing people and or efforts around that is where we're looking for help. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's not so much like, hey, CNCF, hire a bunch of moderators. It's more of like, we have policies and things in place that just need to be taken to like that next level. And now that we have things like the CNCF help desk, which we have direct access to, we can kind of have like measurable inputs and outputs of like, hey, we really need this. Hey, we, as opposed to before where we're kind of not really sure what to ask for and what not to ask for. So we're kind of working through our charter now to make more things more explicit, but that's like a long ongoing process that we still need to work on. But Slack felt like a place to start because that was a problem point that we've had recently, and an area kind of where we could start to move the ball forward.
So George, what are we asking here? Somebody just for Slack, or are we asking for a community manager?
The way I would pitch this, I guess, is a community manager to help manage and build a team, similar how SIG docs just didn't hire a tech, CNCF just didn't hire Zach to write docs, right? He put together a program, different sub-projects underneath that helped kind of grow and build community so that people that do want to participate in these things have a place to go so that they can like develop that, as opposed to now where we're kind of doing this and also doing the contributor experience stuff, like a dedicated person who could put programs together and that sort of thing.
Okay. So can we write what you just said as a paragraph that we can go shop around?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
I will add it to the issue.
So CNCF already has like user community person, Cheryl. I'm blanking on her last name.
We've already spoken to her.
Yeah, is this the thing that, so like, I'm not sure this necessarily falls in that wheelhouse, because I feel like that's about engaging end users of all CNCF projects. And just so I understand, I think what we're talking about here is like, I don't want to live in a world where there's one Slack for Kubernetes contributors and there's another Slack for the end users of Kubernetes. I feel like that creates a bad firewall between the two communities. And part of what makes Kubernetes Slack really great.
We're not.
Right.
We're
Don't
not
go
doing
there,
that.
Aaron.
We
Don't
are
go
not
there,
doing
Aaron.
that.
Right now,
Yeah.
we are focused. There is one job description that we're going to write down, and then we're going to go find somebody to fund it.
Yeah.
I want to make sure Brandon has a chance to talk too, Brandon and Michelle, because they're the ones who would be interfacing.
Yeah.
Okay, but so we're not doing that division, right? We're doing
No,
the
absolutely
one thing.
not.
And the reason we're asking for help is because we feel we have enough staff to do half of the problem, and we need somebody to help us with the other half, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, so just as part of this, I'm glad you brought it up. I think before going straight to the CNCF, I'm going to take a look at this a little bit more, see what questions need to be asked, what a proposal template would look like. That's kind of like 2 steps down the line. First, it would be like, should this be a SIG? Should this be a committee? So we can just like tease that out a little bit more. And I think we can do that on the thread or on a mailing list instead of here. But glad you brought it up.
Okay, I'll put everything in the ticket. Thank you.
I know it's been very frustrating. Paris, George, thanks for keeping the faith and keeping this moving.
Are there any other questions regarding that?
I felt like there was a lot of conversation when we initially discussed Slack, saying that staffing up with new people and adding some automation, we all were openly acknowledging was just, to use George's words, like putting some more fingers in the dike. And we were doing that temporarily until we found like what the ultimate and desired end state would be. Is this that document or proposal of the desired end state, or is that forthcoming?
We don't have anyone to write that proposal. That's the problem. Our wheels are spent. Cycles are done.
I can help y'all here. I know y'all are like burnt out. Like, I'll help y'all with a proposal, and then we can figure out what we need to ask for.
Great. Any last words with regards to this? We should move on. I'm going once, twice, 3 times. I'm going to try and skip over I'm going to go through the important soon that are in the backlog because we only have 5 minutes left, and try to get tease out updates that might have happened. Funding and budgeting. This actually falls in line with this conversation. I know that Brandon and Michelle were on the hook to do updates here.
Both of us, for this issue and the next one, didn't have a chance to get that done by this meeting, but we have it on our to-do list for next week.
All right, that sounds great. Is there any...
I have a question about the ecosystem project governance one. I'm just curious about what it is about, because from what I understand, it's about developing policies and procedures for donated code, but we already have that. And the GitHub management team is responsible for making sure that the policies are followed and also doing the actual migration.
Okay. Could you link to where the policies are? I wasn't aware that we had.
Yeah, I've added a link in the comment. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll take a look at those. It's possible we can close them out.
Cool.
Okay, we can follow up on this one, these 2 items next time too as well. We talked about cloud provider. We talked about user groups. That's also active. Finding homes for unknown areas of the project.
I know last time I talked about getting the blog owned by the project. I have not formally approached SIGDocs, but I've had both Caitlin and Zach approach me, and they're interested in that in particular. Paris?
I have an update if we want to talk about that. Are we talking about the blog specifically right now?
We're talking about unknown areas of the project. The blog was one of that we discussed last time.
Oh. So Caitlin is going to start a editorial team. which will be good, and that'll have different guidelines and qualifications, and be set up similar to the release team for an open and transparent blog process, and then also come up with even more blog guidelines that are more refined. And then SIG Docs is going to own that as a sub-project, and that sub-project will then own the content to the blog.
There are a couple other things that are underneath this umbrella issue. I know we've had it assigned for a couple of times. Do folks think that you'll have a chance to take a look at some of these other ones? I know we discussed the blog for quite some time last time, but there are a couple of other issues that are kind of lumped in together with this. It's possible that we just retitle this one to deal with one item and then break out these other ones as needed.
Right. A couple of those things come under the code organization subproject of SIG architecture.
That is true.
But not others. Yeah.
Yeah, not others though. Perhaps as an action item, I can follow up offline. All right. We did the Slack moderation project. There's a couple other ones. Those are all the important issues that we have. One of the ones that's been longstanding, that we've talked about and we've wanted to address. We got 1 minute left. Perhaps we can give a minor update to see where we're at with code of conduct documentation.
I think this
So
is
Paris or Michelle.
Sorry, go
ahead, Paris.
I was just going to say we're still working through the charter revisions. We have some disagreements that we're still trying to work through on that. And hopefully meeting either Monday or Tuesday of next week to put some of that stuff to bed so that we can get you all to review it.
That sounds great, Paris. If it helps to slim down the charter and just post what is agreed on, then I would be good with that too. If that helps.
I will definitely pass along the message.
Okay. Just for prodding for my own edification next time, what do folks think is the best way for me to follow up on individual issues before the next steering committee, so we can get an update, so I don't have to like chase everybody down in the meeting? Would folks like me to? Last time I sent an email to the list. Would people prefer like an earlier email to the list, or would you like me to ping on the individual issues? Or how do folks prefer me to cat wrangle here?
A ping next week, because I feel like you pinged maybe just a day or two before this meeting.
2 days before.
Yeah, I think a weekly ping would help.
Okay.
The email was really helpful for me, even though I couldn't get to things. But if it helps you moderate, maybe putting each item on the agenda and then just assigning people to it on the document is something is a process we could consider, just so so that people know they own that, the presentation of that item at the meeting, and they can take advantage of it.
I like that one too as well.
Yeah, the email was just
maybe I'll do a little bit of both. All right, but we are at time, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So if you have any other questions, comments, complaints, concerns, please take it to the list. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye, everyone.